In the dead of winter, Ethan Rollins, Wyoming's wealthiest rancher, discovered his new maid doing something that would shatter his frozen heart forever. What started as a simple test of character became a revelation that changed everything. Tonight, I'm sharing the incredible true story of how a grieving millionaire pretended to sleep just to catch his shy maid in the act. And what he witnessed left him speechless. Stay with me until the very end. This story will move you to tears. And don't forget to comment your city below so I can see how far this tale travels across the world. The Wyoming wind howled through the valley like a banshee, carrying with it the scent of snow and the promise of another brutal winter. Against this harsh backdrop stood the Rollins mansion, a testament to wealth and power that seemed to mock the desolation surrounding it. Its windows glowed warmly in the gathering dusk, but the light was deceiving. Inside those walls lived a man whose heart had grown colder than the frozen ground beneath his boots. Ethan Rollins stood at his study window, whiskey glass in hand, watching the last of his ranch hands hurry toward the bunkhouse. At 38, he was the richest man for 100 miles in any direction, owner of the largest cattle operation in the state, and master of more land than some small countries could claim. His dark hair was touched with premature silver at the temples, and his green eyes, once warm and full of life, now held the distant chill of a man who had seen too much sorrow. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 7 times, its deep tone echoing through rooms that felt more like a mausoleum than a home. Ethan took another sip of whiskey, feeling the familiar burn that had become his nightly companion. 3 years. 3 long years since the accident that had torn his world apart, leaving him with nothing but wealth he no longer cared about, and a heart that felt like it had been carved from stone. "Mr. Rollins." The voice was so soft he almost missed it over the wind. Ethan turned to see Mrs. Henderson, his housekeeper of 15 years, standing in the doorway with her coat already buttoned up. "I'll be heading home now, sir. The new girl should be arriving any minute." Ethan nodded curtly, not trusting himself to speak. Another maid, the 4th one this year. They never lasted long. His cold demeanor and the mansion's oppressive atmosphere drove them away within weeks. Mrs. Henderson had tried to convince him that having help during the day wasn't enough, that the house needed tending at night too, but Ethan suspected she was more concerned about his isolation than his housekeeping needs. "Her name is Clara Bennett," Mrs. Henderson continued, lingering in the doorway. 24 years old, from Ohio. She comes highly recommended, very quiet and hard-working. I've prepared the small room off the kitchen for her." "Fine." The word came out harsher than Ethan intended, and he saw Mrs. Henderson flinch slightly. He'd been doing that a lot lately, pushing people away with his tone, his coldness, his refusal to let anyone get close enough to matter. After Mrs. Henderson left, Ethan returned to his whiskey and his vigil at the window. The snow was falling harder now, thick flakes that would soon blanket the valley in pristine white, beautiful and deadly like so many things in this harsh land. He was so lost in his brooding that he almost missed the old pickup truck struggling up the winding drive, its headlights cutting through the swirling snow. The truck coughed to a stop near the front steps, and Ethan watched as the driver's door opened. A small figure emerged, hunched against the wind, pulling a battered suitcase from the truck bed. Even from his vantage point, Ethan could see she was tiny, barely reaching his shoulder, he estimated. The wind whipped at her long brown hair as she hurried toward the front door, her movements quick and nervous. The doorbell's chime seemed unnaturally loud in the silence of the house. Ethan considered ignoring it, letting her stand out there until she gave up and left like the others. But something, perhaps a remnant of the man he used to be, made him set down his glass and walk to the front door. When he opened it, his first impression was of enormous brown eyes in a pale, heart-shaped face. She was even smaller than he'd thought, with delicate features that made her look younger than her 24 years. Her cheeks were flushed pink from the cold. and snowflakes clung to her dark hair. She wore a thin coat that had seen better days, and carried herself with the careful posture of someone accustomed to making themselves invisible. "Mr. Rollins." Her voice was barely above a whisper, and she had to clear her throat before continuing. "I'm Clara Bennett. Mrs. Henderson hired me as the night maid." Ethan studied her for a long moment, taking in the way she clutched her suitcase handle with white knuckles, the way her eyes darted everywhere but to his face. She was afraid of him already, and he'd barely said a word. Good. Fear would keep her at a distance, prevent the complications that came with caring about people. "You're late," he said finally, though he had no idea what time she was supposed to arrive. Clara's eyes widened and she stammered an apology. "I'm sorry, sir. The roads were terrible and my truck had trouble with the hills. It won't happen again, I promise." Without another word, Ethan stepped aside to let her in. She entered hesitantly, like a deer ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. Her eyes swept over the grand foyer with its marble floors and crystal chandelier, and he saw her swallow hard. Everything about her radiated discomfort. The way she held her suitcase in front of her like a shield, the way she pressed her lips together as if afraid to speak without permission. "Mrs. Henderson left instructions in your room," Ethan said, his voice echoing in the vast space. "You'll work nights 7 to 7. Stay out of my way, do your job, and we'll get along fine." Clara nodded quickly, her hair falling forward to hide her face. "Yes, sir, I understand." "Do you—" Ethan stepped closer and she instinctively took a step back. "This isn't some cozy family home, Miss Bennett. This is a workplace. I don't want conversation, I don't want friendship, and I don't want you thinking your presence here means anything beyond the wages you'll earn. Are we clear?" If his harshness affected her, she didn't show it beyond a slight tremor in her voice. "Crystal clear, Mr. Rollins." He turned toward his study, then paused. "Your room is through the kitchen. Don't disturb me unless the house is burning down." As he walked away, he heard her whispered, "Thank you, sir," and the soft sound of her footsteps heading toward the back of the house. Ethan poured himself another whiskey and tried to ignore the pang of something that felt suspiciously like guilt. She was just another employee, nothing more. The sooner she understood that, the better for both of them. The next few days passed in a blur of routine that Ethan had perfected over the past 3 years. He rose early, spent his days managing the ranch operations, and returned to his study each evening to drink and brood until exhaustion finally drove him to bed. The only sign that Clara Bennett existed was the subtle evidence of her work. Floors that gleamed a little brighter, furniture free of dust fires that burned steadily in the hearths throughout the house. She was remarkably good at being invisible, exactly as he'd demanded. Sometimes he would catch a glimpse of her disappearing around a corner, always with her head down, always carrying some tool of her trade. She never spoke unless spoken to, never lingered where she might encounter him, and never gave him any reason to acknowledge her presence. It was perfect, exactly what he wanted. So why did her very invisibility begin to irritate him? On her 4th night in the house, Ethan found himself unable to concentrate on the ranch ledgers spread across his desk. The numbers blurred together as his mind wandered to questions he had no business asking. Where had she come from? What circumstances had brought a young woman to Wyoming to work as a night maid for a man who treated her like she didn't exist? And why did she accept his coldness without complaint? He shook his head angrily, pouring another whiskey. It didn't matter, none of it mattered. She was here to work, nothing more. But as the weeks passed, Ethan found himself increasingly aware of Clara's presence in his house. Not because she was intrusive, quite the opposite. She moved through the mansion like a ghost, completing her tasks with an efficiency that impressed him despite himself. The house had never been cleaner, warmer, more welcoming. Even the rooms he rarely entered seemed to breathe easier under her care. It was during the 3rd week of her employment that Ethan's carefully constructed indifference began to crack. He'd been working late in his study, poring over contracts for a cattle sale, when exhaustion finally overtook him. Instead of dragging himself upstairs to his bedroom, he'd simply pushed the papers aside and laid his head down on the desk, intending to rest for just a few minutes. The next thing he knew, he was warm. Someone had covered him with a blanket, the soft wool throw that usually draped over the chair by the fireplace. The fire, which had been dying when he'd fallen asleep, now burned brightly, filling the room with gentle warmth. Through his barely opened eyes, Ethan could see Clara moving quietly about the room, adjusting the curtains, straightening books on shelves, her movements careful and deliberate. He should have announced that he was awake, should have told her to leave him alone. Instead, he found himself feigning sleep, watching her through his lashes as she went about her work. There was something peaceful about her presence, something that eased the constant tension in his chest. She worked with a quiet grace, never hurrying, despite the magnitude of her tasks, never showing frustration when she had to clean around his sleeping form. When she was finished with the room, she should have left. Instead, she approached his desk with hesitant steps. Ethan forced his breathing to remain even as she gently adjusted the blanket around his shoulders, tucking it carefully so it wouldn't slip. Her touch was feather-light, respectful, and achingly tender. "I'm sorry you're so sad, Mr. Rollins," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "I don't know what happened to you, but I can see it in your eyes. I wish I could help somehow, but I know you don't want that from me. Still, I hope someday you'll find peace." She turned to go, then paused, her voice even softer than before. "I lost my parents in a car accident 2 years ago. I know what it's like to feel like you're drowning in grief, like you'll never surface again. But we do surface eventually. We have to for the people we've lost. They wouldn't want us to stay underwater forever." And then she was gone, leaving Ethan alone with her words echoing in his mind and a crack in his armor that he couldn't will away. Sleep eluded him for the rest of the night. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard Clara's gentle voice speaking words of compassion he didn't deserve. She'd recognized his pain, not just seen it, but understood it from her own experience. The knowledge that she'd lost her parents should have satisfied his curiosity about her background, but instead it only raised more questions. How had she ended up here so far from home? What other sorrows had she endured in her young life? Over the following weeks, Ethan found himself staying in his study later and later, always with work spread across his desk to justify his presence should anyone ask. He told himself he was simply being more productive, but the truth was more complicated. He'd begun to look forward to Clara's nightly ministrations with an anticipation that both thrilled and terrified him. She always seemed to know when he was truly asleep versus when he was pretending. On the nights when exhaustion genuinely claimed him, she would cover him with the blanket and tend the fire without a word. But on the nights when he feigned sleep, she would linger after her work was done, speaking to him in whispered confessions that revealed pieces of her soul. "I was engaged once," she told him one night, her voice heavy with old pain. "His name was David. We were going to be married in the spring. But after my parents died, he said he couldn't handle my grief. He said I'd become too sad, too broken. Maybe he was right, but it still felt like losing everyone I'd ever loved all over again." Another night. "I worked 3 jobs in Ohio just to keep my parents' house, but it wasn't enough. The bank foreclosed anyway. That's when I knew I had to start over somewhere new, somewhere that didn't remind me of everything I'd lost. And another, sometimes I wonder if I'll ever feel normal again, if I'll ever wake up without that hollow feeling in my chest, like something vital has been carved out of me. But then I think about my parents, about how they'd want me to be happy, and I try to push through another day." Each revelation hit Ethan like a physical blow. Here was someone who understood his pain intimately, who'd walked the same dark paths he'd been stumbling through for 3 years. Her losses were different from his, parents instead of a wife and son, but the grief was achingly familiar. The loneliness, the struggle to find meaning in a world that had been irrevocably changed, the way sorrow could hollow you out until you felt like you were barely alive. As winter deepened and the nights grew longer, Ethan found himself genuinely looking forward to Clara's presence in his study. Her soft-spoken confessions had become a lifeline he didn't fully understand. She spoke of her memories with such tenderness, her love for her lost parents so evident in every word. It made him think of Sarah and little Matthew in ways he hadn't allowed himself to in years, not just their deaths but their lives, the joy they'd brought him before tragedy struck. "I keep my mother's recipe book," Clara whispered one particularly cold night, adjusting his blanket with careful hands. "I can't bring myself to cook from it yet, but I carry it with me everywhere. It smells like her kitchen, like cinnamon and vanilla and love. Someday I'll be strong enough to make her apple pie again, but not yet." The image of Clara carrying her mother's recipes like a talisman of love nearly undid him. He wanted to tell her about Sarah's garden, how he'd kept it going for a year after the accident, before finally letting it die because tending it hurt too much. He wanted to share his own talismans. Matthew's favorite stuffed bear still sitting on the boy's bed, Sarah's perfume bottle on her vanity untouched and gathering dust. But he remained silent, trapped by his own walls and the fear of what might happen if he let her see the broken man beneath his cold exterior. The first real test of his resolve came on a night in late December when a blizzard struck the valley with unprecedented fury. Ethan had been tracking the storm all day, watching the weather reports with growing concern. By evening, the wind was howling like a living thing, and snow was falling so heavily that he could barely see the barn from his study window. He'd dismissed the ranch hands early, knowing they needed to get to the bunkhouse before the storm made travel impossible. The house felt more isolated than usual, cut off from the world by walls of wind and snow. It was the kind of night that made a man think about mortality, about how quickly and completely nature could erase everything humans had built. Clara arrived for her shift right on time, somehow having made it from her room to begin her nightly routine, despite the howling wind that shook the very foundations of the house. Ethan found himself listening for her footsteps, taking comfort in the knowledge that he wasn't completely alone in the storm. Around midnight, the power went out. The house plunged into darkness so complete that Ethan couldn't see his hand in front of his face. Emergency lighting kicked in a few seconds later, but it was dim and eerie, casting strange shadows on the walls. Ethan felt his way to the flashlight he kept in his desk drawer, clicking it on just as he heard rapid footsteps in the hallway outside his study. Clara appeared in his doorway, her own flashlight beam wavering slightly with what he realized was nervousness. "Mr. Rollins, are you all right? The power's out throughout the house." It was the first time she'd spoken directly to him since her arrival, and her voice was higher than usual with anxiety. Ethan found himself oddly pleased that her first concern had been for his welfare. "I'm fine," he said, standing up from his desk. "Do you know where the generator is?" Clara shook her head. "Mrs. Henderson mentioned there was one, but she didn't show me where." Of course she hadn't. Mrs. Henderson probably assumed Clara would never need to know such things, that Ethan would handle any emergencies himself. He grabbed a heavier flashlight from his desk drawer and moved toward the door. "It's in the basement. Stay here." "Wait." Clara's voice stopped him at the threshold. "I mean, if it's all right with you, sir, I'd rather come with you. This storm, it's frightening. I'd feel better staying close." Ethan turned to study her face in the flashlight beam. Her dark eyes were wide with genuine fear, though he suspected it was more than just the storm that had her rattled. Being alone in a strange house during a power outage would be unsettling for anyone, but for someone who'd already lost so much, the vulnerability might feel overwhelming. He should have insisted she stay in the study, should have maintained the distance he'd established between them. Instead, he found himself nodding curtly. "Stay close and watch your step. The basement stairs are steep." They made their way through the darkened house together, their flashlight beams dancing ahead of them like will-o'-the-wisps. The storm's fury seemed even more intense from inside the house, the wind moaning through the eaves and rattling windows with enough force to make the glass vibrate. Every few seconds the house would shudder under a particularly strong gust, and Clara would move closer to Ethan's side. The basement was a cavern of shadows filled with the accumulated detritus of years. Old furniture boxes of memories Ethan couldn't bear to face equipment for maintaining the house's various systems. The generator sat in the far corner, a hulking metal beast that Ethan hadn't needed to use in over a year. Getting it started proved more challenging than expected. The engine turned over several times without catching, and Ethan found himself growing increasingly frustrated as he worked by flashlight. Clara held her beam steady for him, never complaining about the cold or the darkness, just quietly supporting his efforts. "There," Ethan muttered as the generator finally roared to life. Lights flickered on throughout the basement, and he could hear the house's heating system rumbling back to life upstairs. "That should hold us until morning." As they climbed back toward the main floor, Clara spoke softly behind him. "Thank you for letting me come with you. I know you prefer to be alone, but the dark and the storm, they brought back some difficult memories." Ethan paused on the stairs, turning to look at her. In the restored lighting, he could see that her face was pale, her eyes haunted by whatever memories the storm had stirred up. "The accident?" he asked before he could stop himself. Clara nodded, not seeming surprised that he'd remembered her earlier confession. It was a night like this. Icy roads, poor visibility. They were coming home from dinner at their favorite restaurant. She managed a sad smile. 32 years of marriage, and they still had date nights every Friday. The pain in her voice was so raw, so familiar, that Ethan felt his own carefully constructed walls threatening to crumble. Without thinking, he reached out and touched her shoulder, the first intentional physical contact he'd made with another human being in months. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. "Thank you. That means more than you know." They stood there on the stairs for a moment, two broken people finding unexpected solace in shared understanding. Then the lights flickered, reminding them both of the storm still raging outside, and the spell was broken. Back in his study, Ethan found it impossible to concentrate on anything but Clara's presence in the house. He could hear her moving through the rooms, continuing her nightly routine despite the storm and the earlier power outage. Her dedication impressed him. Another person might have used the chaos as an excuse to cut corners, but Clara seemed determined to maintain her standards regardless of circumstances. Around 2 in the morning, he heard her approach his study. This time, instead of pretending to be asleep, he looked up from his papers as she appeared in the doorway. "I don't want to disturb you," she said hesitantly, "but I noticed the fire was getting low. Would it be all right if I—" "Go ahead," Ethan said, setting down his pen. He watched as she moved to the fireplace, adding logs with practiced efficiency. The flames leaped higher, casting dancing shadows on the walls and filling the room with renewed warmth. "Clara," he said as she turned to leave, and she froze at the sound of her name on his lips. It was the first time he'd used it, and something in his tone made her turn back to face him. "Sir, the storm should be over by morning. If you need anything before then, if the power goes out again, or if you're concerned about anything, don't hesitate to find me." A smile transformed her face, small but genuine, lighting her features in a way that made her truly beautiful for the first time since he'd met her. "Thank you, Mr. Rollins. That's very kind." After she left, Ethan sat staring into the fire, his mind churning with emotions he'd tried to bury. For the first time in 3 years, he'd connected with another human being, really connected, not just the superficial interactions necessary for business. And it had felt good, dangerous but good. The storm passed by dawn, leaving behind a world transformed by snow and ice. Ethan stood at his study window, watching the sun rise over a landscape that glittered like diamonds. The beauty of it struck him unexpectedly, and for a moment he felt something that might have been peace, But with the morning light came the return of his defenses. What had passed between him and Clara during the storm had been born of circumstance and vulnerability. In the harsh light of day, it seemed foolish to read too much into it. She was still his employee, still someone he needed to keep at a distance for both their sakes. Yet as the days passed, Ethan found that distance increasingly difficult to maintain. Something fundamental had shifted during that storm-tossed night. Some barrier between them had developed hairline cracks that threatened to spread. He caught himself listening for Clara's footsteps, looking forward to the evidence of her care that he found each morning in his study. The blanket that appeared whenever he fell asleep at his desk, the fire that never died completely no matter how late he stayed up, the way his coffee cup was always clean and ready for morning, positioned just where he liked it on his desk. Small gestures barely noticeable, but they spoke of attention and care that went beyond mere duty. And then came the night that changed everything. It was 3 days after the blizzard when Ethan first heard Clara's voice in the darkness, speaking words not meant for his ears but for the silence itself. He had fallen asleep at his desk again, the whiskey glass empty, beside a stack of unread correspondence. The fire had burned low, casting the study in amber shadows that danced with each gust of wind outside. Through the haze of half-sleep, he heard her enter the room with her usual quiet grace. The familiar sounds followed, the soft whisper of wood being added to the fire, the gentle rustle of fabric as she retrieved the blanket from its usual place. But then came something new, something that made him freeze beneath the pretense of slumber. "You're working too hard again." Clara's voice was barely above a whisper meant for no one but herself as she settled the blanket around his shoulders. "Mrs. Henderson says you used to smile sometimes before. She keeps a photograph on her desk, you with a woman and a little boy. They had your eyes, especially the child." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Sarah and Matthew, Mrs. Henderson still kept that photo after all these years, taken at the church picnic the summer before the accident. He'd forgotten it existed, had forgotten that other people held memories of his family's happiness. Clara's hand paused on the blanket's edge, her touch feather-light against his shoulder. "I wonder what happened to them. I wonder if that's why you've built these walls around yourself. Why you work until you collapse rather than go upstairs to what must be a very lonely bed." The accuracy of her observation struck him like a physical blow. She saw too much, understood too much. He should have been angry at her presumption, should have sat up and dismissed her for overstepping boundaries. Instead, he lay perfectly still, desperate to hear what she would say next. "I do the same thing, you know," she continued, her voice growing even softer. "Work until I'm too tired to think, too exhausted to remember. It's easier than facing the empty spaces where love used to live. But it doesn't really work, does it? The grief finds you anyway in the quiet moments between one task and the next." She moved away from the desk, and he heard her adjusting things around the room, straightening books, folding the throw that had been draped over the reading chair, tending to the fire until it blazed with renewed warmth. Each small act was performed with a care that spoke of something deeper than professional duty. "My mother used to say that grief was just love with nowhere to go," Clara murmured, returning to stand beside his desk. "I didn't understand what she meant then, but I do now. All that love you had for them, it's still inside you, isn't it? Still burning like a flame that refuses to be extinguished. Maybe that's why you work so late, why you drink alone in this big empty house. You're trying to exhaust the love, trying to wear it down until it doesn't hurt anymore." Tears pressed against Ethan's closed eyelids. When was the last time someone had spoken about Sarah and Matthew with such gentle understanding? When was the last time anyone had acknowledged that his coldness came from love rather than its absence? "But love isn't meant to be extinguished," Clara whispered, and he felt rather than saw her lean closer. "It's meant to be transformed, to find new ways to exist in the world. I don't know how yet. I'm still learning myself, but I think they would want you to carry their love forward, not bury it beneath work and whiskey." She straightened then, and he heard her moving toward the door, but she paused at the threshold, her voice carrying back to him across the room. I pray for them sometimes, your family. I don't know their names or their story, but I pray that they're at peace, and I pray that someday you'll find your way back to the man you were when they were alive. Not the same man. That's impossible. But a man who can smile again, who can let others care for him without pushing them away. And then she was gone, leaving Ethan alone with words that cracked his heart wide open. He lay there in the restored warmth of the fire, tears sliding silently down his cheeks as he let himself remember Sarah's laugh, Matthew's sticky hugs, the life they'd built together before fate tore it all away. For the first time since the accident, he didn't fight the memories. He let them come. Sarah humming while she cooked breakfast, Matthew's endless questions about everything from clouds to cattle, the way they'd both curl up beside him on the couch for story time. Beautiful memories, painful in their perfection, but healing too in their acknowledgement that love had existed, that happiness had been real. The next morning brought a clarity Ethan hadn't experienced in years. As he shaved and dressed for the day ahead, he found himself thinking not about the ranch's endless demands, but about Clara's nocturnal vigil. She'd been tending to him for weeks now, offering comfort and care he'd neither requested nor acknowledged. The least he could do was ensure she was being properly cared for in return. He found Mrs. Henderson in the kitchen preparing her usual efficient breakfast. She looked up in surprise when he entered. His morning appearances in the kitchen were rare enough to constitute an event. "Good morning, Mr. Rollins. Is everything all right?" "The new maid," Ethan said without preamble. "Clara Bennett. How is she settling in?" Mrs. Henderson's eyebrows rose slightly. "Very well, sir. She's an excellent worker, very thorough and quiet. I've had no complaints. And her living situation, her room, her meals, her general welfare." Now Mrs. Henderson looked genuinely puzzled. In 3 years, Ethan had never inquired about the personal circumstances of any employee. "She seems comfortable enough, though. I suspect she's not eating properly. Young women these days always worrying about their figures, and I think she might be sending most of her wages home. Her clothes are quite worn, and she's refused my offers to advance her money for warmer things." Sending money home. To whom family members struggling in Ohio debts, left by her parents' deaths. Ethan filed the questions away for later consideration. "See that she's properly fed," he instructed, "and arrange for her to have warmer clothing. The house gets cold at night, especially in winter." "Of course, sir. Shall I tell her the clothing allowance comes from you?" "No." The answer was immediate and firm. "Let her think it's standard policy for all employees." Mrs. Henderson nodded, but Ethan caught the small smile that played at the corners of her mouth. She'd worked for him long enough to recognize the significance of his concern, even if he wasn't ready to acknowledge it himself. That evening, Ethan found himself unable to concentrate on the financial reports spread across his desk. Instead, he kept glancing toward the door, listening for Clara's arrival. When she finally appeared, punctual as always, he looked up from his papers with an attention that seemed to startle her. "Good evening, Mr. Rollins," she said softly, hesitating in the doorway. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all. Please come in." She entered with her usual quiet grace, but Ethan noticed something different about her tonight. She moved more slowly than usual, and there was a pallor to her skin that concerned him. When she knelt to tend the fire, he saw her hand tremble slightly as she arranged the kindling. Clara. Her name felt strange on his lips, but not unpleasant. "Are you feeling well?" She looked up in surprise, clearly not expecting the question. "I'm fine, sir. Thank you for asking." But she wasn't fine. Ethan could see it in the careful way she moved in the shadows under her eyes, in the slight catch in her breathing when she thought he wasn't watching. He should have let it go, should have returned to his papers and maintained the professional distance that protected them both. Instead, he found himself setting down his pen and studying her with growing concern. "When did you last eat a proper meal?" The question hung in the air between them, more intimate than any he'd asked since her arrival. Clara's cheeks flushed pink and she looked away. "I eat plenty, Mr. Rollins. Mrs. Henderson takes very good care of me." "That wasn't what I asked." There was something in his tone, not harsh, but quietly insistent, that made her meet his eyes again. What he saw there confirmed his suspicions. She was exhausted, probably undernourished, running on determination and stubbornness rather than proper rest and food. "I had some bread and tea earlier," she admitted reluctantly. "I'm not very hungry these days. It happens sometimes when things are difficult." "Difficult how?" Clara bit her lip, clearly debating how much to reveal. "My mother's sister back in Ohio. She's been ill and medical bills are expensive. I send what I can, but it's never enough. Sometimes I worry that if something happens to her too, I'll have no one left at all." The confession hit Ethan like a punch to the chest. Here was someone already carrying the weight of enormous loss, now facing the possibility of losing the only family she had left, and she was literally starving herself to send money home, sacrificing her own welfare for someone else's need. "Sit down," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "Sir, I should really get started on my work." "Sit down." This time there was no arguing with his tone. Clara sank into the chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her dark eyes wide with uncertainty. Ethan stood and moved to the small bar cart in the corner of the room, pouring a measure of brandy into a snifter. "Drink this," he said, placing it in her hands. "It will help warm you." "Mr. Rollins, I couldn't. I don't drink, and I'm on duty." "Consider it medicinal." He returned to his chair and leaned back, studying her with an intensity that made her fidget. "How long have you been sending money to your aunt?" "Since I arrived here. She raised me after my parents died, took me in when she could barely afford to feed herself. I owe her everything." "And you're willing to sacrifice your health to repay that debt?" Clara's chin lifted with a flash of defiance that surprised him. "She's family. She's all I have left. If that means eating less or wearing old clothes, then that's what I do. Family takes care of family." The fierce loyalty in her voice reminded Ethan painfully of Sarah, who'd felt the same devotion to her aging mother. It was admirable and heartbreaking at the same time, this young woman's determination to shoulder burdens that should have been shared. "Your aunt wouldn't want you making yourself ill on her account," he said quietly. "You don't know my aunt." "No, but I know love, and love doesn't demand self-destruction as proof of devotion." Clara stared at him for a long moment, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. "You sound like you know something about love and loss, Mr. Rollins." It was as close as she'd come to directly acknowledging the grief she'd spoken of during her late-night vigils. Ethan felt the familiar urge to retreat, to rebuild the walls she was so skillfully dismantling, but something in her eyes, understanding perhaps, or simple human compassion, made him stay in the moment. "I had a wife and son," he said, the words feeling rusty from disuse. "They died 3 years ago. Car accident." Clara's intake of breath was sharp with sympathy. "I'm so sorry. I wondered—" "That is Mrs. Henderson mentioned." She trailed off, clearly unsure how to proceed. "It's all right. You can ask." "Were you happy before?" The question was so simple, so direct, that it caught him off guard. "Were you happy?" Not "how did it happen?" or "how are you coping?" but "were you happy?" as if she understood that before the grief came, the joy mattered just as much as the sorrow. "Yes," he said, and felt something ease in his chest at the admission. "We were very happy. Sarah loved this house, loved the ranch. She had a garden where she grew vegetables and flowers, and she'd spend hours out there with Matthew teaching him the names of plants. He was 5, just starting to really talk about everything he saw. He wanted to be a cowboy like his dad." "They sound wonderful." They were. Ethan looked down at his hands, surprised to find them steady. "I thought I'd dishonor their memory if I ever stopped grieving for them, but listening to you these past weeks, You've made me wonder if maybe the opposite is true. Maybe I dishonor them by refusing to live." Clara set down the brandy snifter with careful precision. "May I tell you something my mother used to say?" Ethan nodded. "She said that the dead don't want to be anchors for the living. They want to be sails." The image was so beautiful, so precisely right, that Ethan felt tears threaten again. Sarah and Matthew as sails rather than anchors, carrying him forward instead of holding him back. It was a radical shift in thinking, one that both terrified and liberated him. "I've been using them as anchors," he admitted, "letting my grief drag me down instead of letting their love lift me up." "Grief is complicated," Clara said softly. "There's no right way to do it, no timeline. That makes sense, but I think they'd want you to find reasons to smile again. Small reasons at first, maybe. The way sunrise looks on fresh snow, or the satisfaction of work well done, the kindness of someone who covers you with a blanket when you fall asleep at your desk." She flushed as soon as the words were out clearly, not having meant to reference her nightly ministration so directly, but Ethan felt only gratitude for her honesty. "You've been taking care of me," he said. "All these weeks, you've been taking care of me, and I never thanked you. I didn't expect, thank you." The words were quiet but firm. "For the blankets, for the fires, for the way you've treated this house, my home, with such respect. And thank you for the things you've said when you thought I was sleeping. They've meant more than you know." Clara's eyes widened in mortification. "You were awake. Oh God, I'm so sorry. I never should have presumed to speak about your family, about your grief. I had no right." "You had every right." Ethan leaned forward, his voice intense with sincerity. "You understood what no one else has. You saw the love beneath the anger, the loss beneath the coldness. You treated my grief with respect instead of pity." They sat in silence for several moments, the fire crackling softly between them. Outside, the wind had picked up again, whistling around the eaves with a sound that no longer seemed quite so lonely. Something had shifted in the room. Some barrier had been crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. "I should let you get back to your work," Clara said, finally starting to rise from the chair. "Wait." Ethan's voice stopped her halfway to standing. "There's something else. I've spoken to Mrs. Henderson about increasing your wages, enough to help your aunt without requiring you to starve yourself." Clara sank back into the chair, her eyes wide with shock. "Mr. Rollins, I couldn't possibly accept charity." "It's not charity. It's recognition of value. You've been doing far more than a typical night maid, and you should be compensated accordingly." "But I haven't done anything special. You've brought life back to a house that felt like a tomb. You've cared for someone who didn't deserve it and didn't ask for it. You've shown more grace and strength in the face of your own losses than I've managed in 3 years of wallowing in mine." Ethan's voice grew rough with emotion. "If that's not worth a raise, then I don't know what is." Clara's eyes filled with tears that she blinked away rapidly. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll take better care of yourself. Say you'll eat proper meals and buy a warm coat. Say you'll let me help carry some of the burden you've been shouldering alone." "Why?" The question was whispered, vulnerable. "Why would you want to help me?" "Because you saw me when I was invisible to myself. Because you spoke to my grief with tenderness instead of platitudes. Because in taking care of me, you've reminded me what it feels like to matter to someone. Because you're brave and kind and beautiful, and you deserve so much better than the loneliness you've been living with." All of those thoughts flickered through Ethan's mind, but he couldn't voice them. Not yet. The connection between them was too new, too fragile, to bear the weight of such declarations. "Because everyone deserves help when they're struggling," he said instead. "Because kindness should be repaid with kindness." Clara nodded slowly, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "Thank you. For the raise, for the understanding, for everything. You're not at all what I expected when I came here." "What did you expect? Someone cold and cruel. Someone who would make me invisible and keep me afraid." She managed a small smile. "Mrs. Henderson tried to warn me about your moods, about how you'd changed since your family died. But she couldn't have warned me about your kindness because I don't think she's seen it lately." "I haven't shown it lately. Maybe you just needed someone to show it to." The observation hung between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to explore, but the foundation had been laid, the first tentative bridge built across the chasm of their respective griefs. They were no longer employer and employee, only no longer strangers sharing the same house. They were two people who understood loss, who recognized the particular courage required to keep living when everything that mattered had been taken away. And in that understanding, something new was beginning to grow, fragile as a seedling, but persistent as hope itself. That night, for the first time since Clara's arrival, Ethan went upstairs to his bedroom instead of falling asleep at his desk. And for the first time in 3 years, he slept deeply and dreamlessly, untroubled by the ghosts that had haunted his rest for so long. In the morning, he would find his study perfectly tended as always, but the blanket would be folded neatly on the chair, where it belonged, no longer needed as an offering of care. The dance between them had changed, evolved into something richer and more complex. They were still learning the steps, still discovering the boundaries of this new relationship. But for the first time since Sarah and Matthew's deaths, Ethan felt the possibility of genuine human connection stirring in his chest. It was terrifying and wonderful and dangerous all at once. And so began the most dangerous season of Ethan's life. Dangerous because for the first time in 3 years, he felt himself coming back to life, and the sensation was both exhilarating and terrifying. The walls he'd built around his heart were crumbling brick by brick, each conversation with Clara loosening another stone from the fortress of his grief. January melted into February, and with it came a routine that felt almost like normalcy. Ethan found himself looking forward to their evening encounters, those moments when Clara would appear in his study doorway, and they would speak, carefully at first, then with growing ease, about everything from the ranch's daily operations to memories of the people they'd loved and lost. She had begun eating properly, he was pleased to notice, and the warmer clothes Mrs. Henderson had procured made her look less like a ghost haunting his halls. "You're different," Mrs. Henderson observed one morning as she watched Ethan linger over his coffee instead of rushing out to begin his day. "More like your old self." Ethan considered denying it, but the truth was too obvious to dispute. "The maid is working out well." "Clara," Mrs. Henderson corrected with a knowing smile. "Her name is Clara, and she's a remarkable young woman. I'm glad you finally noticed." He had more than noticed. That was the problem. It was during the 3rd week of February that disaster nearly claimed him, and with it any chance of the future that was beginning to unfurl like spring flowers in his frost-hardened heart. The day had started normally enough, checking on cattle, meeting with his foreman about spring breeding plans, reviewing feed supplies in preparation for the calving season. But as evening approached, a distress call came from the north pasture. 3 head of cattle had broken through a fence and wandered onto neighboring property, and with a storm approaching, they needed to be retrieved immediately. Ethan saddled his horse and rode out into the gathering dusk, following the tracks through snow that was beginning to fall more heavily with each passing hour. The wind was picking up too, carrying the sharp bite of a true blizzard on its breath. He should have waited for morning, should have taken additional men with him, but the cattle were valuable breeding stock, and the neighbors had a right to have their property cleared. He found the wayward animals easily enough. 3 heifers huddled near a grove of cottonwoods, lowing mournfully as the storm intensified around them. Getting them back through the broken fence proved more challenging than expected. The cattle were spooked by the wind and snow, and what should have been a simple herding operation turned into a battle against increasingly hostile weather. By the time Ethan got the animals safely back onto his own land, the blizzard had reached its full fury. Snow fell in sheets so thick he could barely see his horse's ears, and the wind howled with a violence that made conversation impossible. He tried to follow the familiar landmarks back toward the house, but in the whiteout conditions, everything looked the same. That's when his horse stepped into a hidden gully. The mare went down hard, her front legs tangling in a mess of snow and hidden rocks. Ethan felt himself flying through the air, felt the jarring impact as he hit the ground, felt the sickening crack that meant his left arm was broken. Pain exploded through his shoulder and down his side as he rolled to a stop in a snowbank that was already beginning to cover him. The horse struggled to her feet, favoring her right foreleg, but otherwise unharmed. She stood over him for a moment, her dark eyes filled with concern, then began picking her way carefully back toward home, taking with her Ethan's only hope of quick rescue. He tried to stand and immediately fell back down, his vision swimming from pain and the beginning stages of hypothermia. The snow was falling so heavily that his own tracks were disappearing within minutes. Even if someone came looking for him, they'd never find him in this whiteout. The ranch house, which couldn't be more than 2 miles away, might as well have been on the moon. Ethan closed his eyes and felt the strange peace that comes with acceptance of death. It seemed almost fitting somehow that he should die the same way his family had, in a storm alone, victims of nature's indifferent fury. At least Clara would be taken care of. He'd made sure of that in his will, updating it just the week before to include provisions for all his longtime employees. Clara. The thought of her sent a spike of regret through his chest, sharper than any physical pain. Just when he'd begun to believe in the possibility of love again, just when he'd started to hope that his heart might heal enough to hold another person close, fate was claiming him too. She would blame herself, he realized with growing anguish. She would think somehow she should have prevented this, should have stopped him from riding out alone. The snow continued to fall, and Ethan felt himself drifting toward the kind of sleep from which there was no waking. His last conscious thought was a prayer that Clara would understand she wasn't responsible, that she would find happiness with someone who could give her all the love she deserved. But death, it seemed, was not finished with Ethan Rollins just yet. Through the haze of approaching unconsciousness, he heard a voice calling his name. Distant at first, then closer, filled with desperation and determination that cut through the storm's roar like a blade through silk. He tried to respond, but his voice was barely a whisper lost in the wind. Then there were hands on his face, warm and gentle, brushing snow from his eyes. Clara's voice close to his ear, now urgent with fear and relief. Ethan, oh God, Ethan, can you hear me? Stay with me, please. Stay with me. He forced his eyes open to find her leaning over him, her dark hair whipping in the wind, her face pale with cold and terror. She'd found him, somehow tracked him through a blizzard that would have defeated men with decades more experience. The impossibility of it struck him, even through his pain-fogged mind. How? He managed to croak. Your horse came back without you. I saw her from the kitchen window, and I knew. Clara's voice broke as she struggled to lift him, her small frame shaking with the effort. I followed her tracks back here. Can you stand? We have to get you home. Ethan tried to push himself upright and gasped as pain shot through his broken arm. Clara saw his distress and immediately moved to support his weight, slipping her shoulder under his good arm with a strength that belied her delicate appearance. Lean on me, she commanded, her voice steadier now that she'd found him alive. I know it hurts, but we have to move. The storm's getting worse. Step by agonizing step, they made their way through the driving snow. Clara seemed to navigate by instinct, never hesitating as she led them through the whiteout toward safety. When Ethan stumbled, she held him up. When he protested that she should leave him and save herself, she told him firmly to shut up and keep walking. Her fierce determination was the only thing keeping him conscious, keeping him moving when every instinct screamed at him to lie down and surrender to the cold. It took them nearly an hour to cover what should have been a 15-minute walk, but finally the lights of the ranch house appeared through the swirling snow like beacons of hope. Clara half carried him up the front steps, shouldering the door open and calling for Mrs. Henderson as they collapsed together in the front hall. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. The doctor was summoned despite the storm. Ethan's arm was set and splinted, and he was bundled into his bed with hot water bottles and blankets while Clara hovered nearby, refusing all suggestions that she rest after her ordeal. "She saved your life?" Dr. Morrison told Ethan as he packed up his medical bag. "Another hour out there and we'd be having a very different conversation. That young woman has more courage than men twice her size." After the doctor left, Ethan found himself alone with Clara for the first time since the rescue. She sat in the chair beside his bed, still wearing the coat and boots she'd thrown on to search for him, her hair damp from melted snow. Dark circles shadowed her eyes and her hands shook slightly. Whether from cold or delayed shock, he couldn't tell. "You should have left me," he said quietly. Clara's head snapped up, her eyes flashing with an anger he'd never seen before. "Don't you dare say that to me. Don't you dare suggest I should have let you die out there. You could have been killed. You could have gotten lost yourself. And then we both would have. But we didn't." Clara leaned forward in her chair, her voice fierce with emotion. "We both made it home, and that's all that matters." "Why?" Ethan asked the question that had been burning in his chest since she'd found him in the snow. "Why did you risk your life for mine?" The question hung between them, heavy with implications neither had been ready to face. Clara was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on her hands clasped in her lap. "Because," she said finally so softly he had to strain to hear, "because somewhere in the past few months you stopped being just my employer. You became someone I care about, someone whose loss would break what's left of my heart." The confession hit Ethan with the force of an avalanche. Here was the truth. They'd both been dancing around the feeling that had been growing between them, despite every attempt to maintain professional distance. Clara cared for him, not as a boss or a provider, but as a man, and God help him, he cared for her too. "Clara," he began, but she shook her head, standing up abruptly. "You don't have to say anything. I know it's inappropriate. I know it's not my place. But I couldn't let you die believing no one would mourn you, because I would have. I would have mourned you every day for the rest of my life." She turned to go, but Ethan caught her hand with his uninjured arm, stopping her at the bedside. "Stay," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Please, I don't want to be alone tonight." Clara hesitated, clearly torn between propriety and compassion. Finally, she sank back into the chair, her hand still clasped in his. "I was ready to die out there," Ethan admitted. "I thought it would be a fitting end, dying the same way Sarah and Matthew did. But when I heard your voice calling my name, when I realized you'd come looking for me." He squeezed her hand gently. "I realized I didn't want to die anymore. I wanted to live. For the first time in 3 years, I wanted to live." Tears slid down Clara's cheeks, but she didn't try to wipe them away. "What does that mean for us?" It was a fair question, one that deserved an honest answer. What did it mean they were no longer just employer and employee, but they weren't quite lovers either? They existed in some liminal space between friendship and romance, bound together by shared grief and growing affection, but constrained by social expectations and their own fears. "I don't know," Ethan said honestly, "but I'd like to find out. If you're willing." Clara nodded, her smile trembling but genuine. "I'm willing." The recovery from his injuries gave Ethan time to think, to plan, to consider the future with more hope than he'd felt in years. Clara spent much of her time in his room during those first few days, reading to him when the pain medication made it hard to concentrate, bringing him meals that Mrs. Henderson had prepared, simply sitting quietly nearby when he needed rest. The easy intimacy that developed between them felt natural, as if they'd been caring for each other for years rather than months. It was during this period of enforced idleness that Ethan made a decision that would change everything between them. When spring arrived and his arm had healed enough for normal activity, he would ask Clara to accompany him to the community barn dance, not as his employee, but as his guest. It would be a public declaration of his feelings, an announcement to the entire valley that Clara Bennett mattered to him as more than hired help. The decision terrified him. 3 years of isolation had made him forget how cruel gossip could be, how quickly a small community could turn against those who violated its unspoken rules. Clara was a servant, an outsider, a woman with no family name or fortune to recommend her. By local standards, she was far beneath him socially, and there would be those who would not hesitate to make their disapproval known. But as March arrived and brought with it the first hints of spring warmth, Ethan found he didn't care what others might think. Clara had saved his life in more ways than one, and he was done hiding his feelings behind professional courtesy. "There's a dance next Saturday," he said one evening as Clara tended the fire in his study. His arm was nearly healed now, and he'd returned to his desk work, though he no longer fell asleep there. "The monthly community gathering at the Morrison barn. I'd like you to come with me." Clara froze with the poker in her hand, turning to stare at him with wide eyes. "Come with you as what?" "As my partner, my date, if you will." The poker clattered to the hearth as Clara sank into the chair across from his desk. "Ethan, I can't. You know I can't. What would people say? I don't care what they say." "But I do." Clara's voice was strained with conflict. "You're Ethan Rollins. You're the most important man in this valley, and I'm just a maid from Ohio, with nothing to my name but debts and sorrows. If I show up on your arm at a community dance, they'll crucify us both." "Let them try." The quiet steel in Ethan's voice made Clara look up sharply. She saw something in his expression that made her breath catch, a determination that brooked no argument, a protective fierceness that reminded her of the way he'd defended his cattle from wolves. "You saved my life." He continued standing and moving around the desk to kneel beside her chair. "You brought me back from the dead, both literally and figuratively. I don't give a damn what anyone thinks about our social positions or our bank accounts. I care about you, Clara, more than I thought I'd ever care about anyone again." Clara's hands fluttered to her throat, her emotions written plainly on her face. "Ethan, say yes," he urged, taking her hands in his. "Say you'll dance with me. Say you'll let me show this entire valley how proud I am to have you by my side." The internal struggle was visible in Clara's eyes, hope warring with fear, love battling with practicality. Finally, she nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes, yes, I'll go with you." The Saturday of the dance dawned clear and warm, one of those perfect spring days that reminded everyone why they endured Wyoming's brutal winters. Clara spent the afternoon in a state of nervous preparation, with Mrs. Henderson fussing over her appearance like a mother preparing her daughter for a first ball. "You look beautiful, dear," Mrs. Henderson assured her as she put the finishing touches on Clara's hair. "Mr. Rollins won't be able to take his eyes off you." Clara studied her reflection in the mirror with wonder. Mrs. Henderson had somehow transformed her simple blue dress into something elegant, and her hair was arranged in a sophisticated style that made her look older, more confident. For the first time since her parents' death, she felt truly beautiful. Ethan was waiting in the front hall when she came downstairs, and the look on his face when he saw her was worth every moment of anxiety she'd endured. He wore a black suit that emphasized his tall, lean frame, and his dark hair was neatly combed back from his strong features, but it was his eyes that took her breath away. Green as spring grass and full of warmth and pride, and something that looked very much like love. "You're stunning," he said, offering her his arm. "Absolutely stunning." The Morrison barn had been transformed for the occasion, decorated with wild flowers and lit by dozens of lanterns that cast everything in a warm golden glow. Musicians tuned their instruments in one corner while tables groaned under the weight of food contributed by every family in the valley. It was exactly the sort of community gathering that Ethan had avoided for 3 years, and he felt Clara tense beside him as they paused in the doorway. The buzz of conversation faltered as people noticed their arrival. Ethan could feel the weight of dozens of stares, could practically hear the whispered speculation beginning to spread through the crowd. He straightened his shoulders and led Clara into the barn with the confidence of a man who owned half the valley. Mr. Rollins, Tom Morrison, their host, approached with a broad smile that didn't quite hide his curiosity. "Good to see you here, and this must be Miss Bennett. Mrs. Henderson's been singing your praises all over town." "Clara," Ethan said, his voice carrying clearly through the barn, "I'd like you to meet Tom Morrison. Tom, Miss Clara Bennett, my partner for this evening." Partner. The word carried implications that weren't lost on anyone present. Ethan saw Tom's eyebrows rise slightly, saw the way conversations stopped as people strained to hear every word. Let them wonder, he thought. Let them talk. Clara deserved to be acknowledged openly, not hidden away like some guilty secret. The evening progressed with a careful dance of social interaction. Some people, like Dr. Morrison and his wife, welcomed Clara, warmly engaging her in genuine conversation and treating her with the respect Ethan demanded. Others were cooler, their smiles polite but strained their eyes full of speculation and barely concealed disapproval. It was during the third dance of the evening that the confrontation Ethan had been expecting finally came. He and Clara were swaying to a gentle waltz when Margaret Hartwell, the valley's self-appointed social arbiter, approached with her cronies in tow. "Ethan, dear," Margaret said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "what a surprise to see you here tonight, and with such interesting company." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. "Margaret, ladies, I don't believe you've been properly introduced to Miss Bennett." "Oh, we know who she is," Margaret replied, her eyes raking over Clara with unconcealed disdain. "Your little maid. How charitable of you to bring her tonight." The insult hit its mark. Clara went rigid in Ethan's arms, her face flushing with humiliation. He felt her start to pull away, saw the shame and hurt in her eyes, and something inside him snapped. "Careful, Margaret," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "You're talking about the woman I intend to marry." The words were out before he'd consciously decided to say them, but Ethan felt no regret. If anything, the declaration felt right, a public claiming that brooked no argument or misunderstanding. Clara gasped softly, her eyes flying to his face in shock, but he kept his gaze fixed on Margaret's stunned expression. "Mary," Margaret sputtered. "Ethan, you can't be serious. She's a servant, a nobody. What could you possibly see in someone so far beneath your station?" "I see kindness," Ethan replied, his arm tightening protectively around Clara's waist. "I see courage and strength and a heart capable of loving without condition. I see a woman who saved my life and helped me remember what it means to be truly alive. If that makes her beneath my station, then perhaps my station isn't worth maintaining." Margaret's face had gone white with shock and anger. "The scandal will ruin you both. No one will accept such a marriage. You'll be ostracized from decent society." "Then perhaps decent society isn't very decent after all." Ethan turned his back on Margaret and her companions, leading Clara away from their poisonous presence. But he could feel the eyes of the entire community on them, now could hear the whispers spreading like wildfire through the barn. Some voices were supportive, but others carried tones of disapproval and shock that made Clara tremble against his side. "Take me home," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Please, Ethan, I can't do this. I can't be the reason you lose everything you've worked for." Instead of heading for the door, Ethan led her to the center of the dance floor as the musicians struck up a new song. "Dance with me," he said firmly. "Show them we have nothing to be ashamed of." Everyone's staring. Let them stare. Let them see how beautiful you are, how gracefully you move, how perfectly we fit together. Let them see that love doesn't recognize social boundaries. Clara looked up into his eyes and saw the absolute certainty there, the unwavering commitment that made her heart race. Slowly, she nodded and allowed him to lead her through the steps of the dance. They moved together as if they'd been dancing for years, Ethan's strong lead guiding Clara through turns and spins that showed off her natural grace. Gradually, other couples joined them on the floor, and the tension in the barn began to ease. Not everyone approved. Ethan could still feel pockets of disapproval radiating from certain corners, but neither were they completely alone in their defiance of convention. "Did you mean it?" Clara asked as they swayed to the music. "About marriage?" "Every word," Ethan replied without hesitation. "I know it's sudden, I know we haven't talked about the future in specific terms, but Clara, I can't imagine my life without you anymore. You've become as essential to me as breathing." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but these were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "I love you," she whispered. "I've loved you for months, but I was too afraid to hope you might feel the same way." "I love you too." Ethan said the words feeling like a benediction on all his lips, more than I ever thought possible. "Will you marry me, Clara Bennett? Will you be my wife and help me build a new life from the ashes of the old?" "Yes." Clara breathed, her smile radiant with happiness. "Yes, with all my heart." The music swelled around them as Ethan spun Clara in a joyful circle, both of them laughing with the pure delight of love acknowledged and accepted. The disapproving stares of Margaret Hartwell and her ilk faded into insignificance. What mattered was this moment, this declaration of commitment that would carry them forward into whatever challenges lay ahead. As the evening wore on, Ethan and Clara found their supporters, as well as their detractors. Morrison offered his heartfelt congratulations, as did several of the younger couples who had always found the rigid social hierarchies of valley life stifling. Mrs. Henderson, when they told her the news, wept with happiness and immediately began planning an engagement celebration. But there were others who made their displeasure known through cold shoulders and whispered comments. The scandal would indeed follow them, Ethan realized. There would be those who would never accept Clara as his equal, who would always see her as the maid who seduced her wealthy employer. The path ahead would not be easy. But as he watched Clara laugh at something Dr. Morrison's wife had said, saw the way she'd blossomed with confidence throughout the evening, Ethan knew he'd made the right choice. Love was worth fighting for, worth sacrificing social standing for, and Clara was worth everything he might lose in claiming her as his own. The dance ended near midnight, with Ethan and Clara among the last to leave. As they walked to his truck under a canopy of stars, Clara slipped her hand into his. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" "For choosing me, for defending me, for making me feel like I'm worth fighting for." Ethan stopped walking and turned to face her, framing her face with his hands. "Clara, you are worth fighting for. You're worth any battle I might have to wage, any price I might have to pay. Don't ever doubt that." He kissed her then, under the Wyoming stars, sealing the promise they'd made to each other on the dance floor. It was a kiss full of love and hope and determination. The kiss of two people ready to face the future together, no matter what obstacles it might hold. As they drove home through the quiet night, Clara rested her head against Ethan's shoulder and felt a peace she hadn't known since her parents' death. She was no longer alone in the world. She had found love again, found a partner who saw her worth, despite what others might think. The road ahead would be challenging, but they would travel it together, and that made all the difference in the world. The morning after the dance brought with it the harsh light of reality, and with it the consequences of their public declaration. Ethan woke to find 3 messages waiting on his answering machine. 2 from business associates expressing concern about his impulsive announcement, and 1 from his lawyer requesting an urgent meeting. The Valley's gossip network, it seemed, had been working overtime. Clara found the evidence of their newfound notoriety in the kitchen, where Mrs. Henderson sat at the table with an expression that mixed pride and worry in equal measure. "There's already talk in town," Mrs. Henderson said without preamble as Clara poured herself a cup of coffee. "Some good, some not so good. Mrs. Patterson from the Mercantile stopped by this morning. Apparently Margaret Hartwell has been making the rounds since dawn, telling anyone who'll listen that you've bewitched poor Mr. Rollins in his grief." Clara's hand trembled slightly as she set down her cup. She'd known this would happen, had tried to warn Ethan about it, but knowing and experiencing were two different things entirely. "What else are they saying?" she asked quietly. Mrs. Henderson reached across the table and patted Clara's hand. "That you're a gold digger from back east, that you planned this from the moment you arrived, that a man in Mr. Rollins' position couldn't possibly be thinking clearly." She paused, studying Clara's stricken face. "But there are others saying different things. Dr. Morrison's wife told half the congregation at early service that she's never seen Mr. Rollins look so happy, so alive. And young Mary Beth Collins said anyone with eyes could see you two are genuinely in love." The conversation was interrupted by Ethan's arrival in the kitchen, still dressed in his work clothes from the morning's ranch duties. He took one look at Clara's pale face and Mrs. Henderson's protective posture and immediately understood the situation. "Bad news travels fast in small towns," he said, pouring himself coffee and settling at the table beside Clara. "I've already had 3 phone calls and a visit from my banker." "Your banker?" Clara's voice was sharp with concern. "Ethan, what if this affects your business relationships? What if people stop wanting to deal with you because of me? Then I'll find new people to deal with." Ethan's tone was matter-of-fact, but Clara could see the tension in the set of his shoulders. "Clara, I meant what I said last night. I won't let other people's small-mindedness dictate how we live our lives. But if it costs you everything, it won't." Ethan reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. "My reputation in this valley isn't built on social position. It's built on fair-dealing hard work and the quality of my livestock. The people who matter, the ones I actually do business with, they care about results, not gossip." Mrs. Henderson nodded approvingly. "Your father built this ranch on respect, not on society tease and church politics. The foundation is stronger than Margaret Hartwell's wounded pride." Despite her reassurances, Clara spent the morning in a state of growing anxiety. Every time the phone rang, she tensed. When a truck pulled into the driveway around noon, she watched from the kitchen window as Ethan went out to meet whoever had come calling her heart in her throat. The visitor turned out to be Jim Carson, Ethan's closest neighbor and oldest friend. Clara watched the two men talk near the barn, trying to read their body language for signs of conflict. When Ethan returned to the house an hour later, his expression was thoughtful but not troubled. "Well?" Clara asked immediately. "Jim wanted to know if I'd lost my mind," Ethan said with a slight smile. "He also wanted to know if you make me happy. When I told him yes to the second question, he said the first one didn't matter. He's not angry. He's concerned. There's a difference." Ethan settled into the chair across from her at the kitchen table. "Jim's worried about the social fallout, about how this might affect my standing in the community, but he also said he's never seen me smile the way I smiled last night, and that has to count for something." Over the next few days, the true measure of their support became clear. The valley divided as small communities often do when faced with scandal into camps of approval and disapproval. Margaret Hartwell led the charge against what she called this unseemly liaison, organizing a boycott of any social events the couple might attend, and making it clear that accepting them would mean exclusion from her inner circle. But there were others who rallied to their defense. Dr. Morrison and his wife made a point of visiting the ranch to offer their congratulations in person. The younger families in the valley, those less entrenched in the old social hierarchies, began dropping by with offers of help for the wedding planning. Even some of the older ranchers' men who valued character over pedigree made their support known through subtle gestures, a nod of approval at the feed store, an invitation to discuss cattle prices inclusion in conversations they might otherwise have avoided. The real test came when Ethan's lawyer, Robert Hayes, requested a private meeting. Clara tried to excuse herself when Hayes arrived, but Ethan insisted she stay. "This concerns both of us," he said firmly. "Whatever you have to say, you can say it in front of my fiancée." Hayes, a thin, precise man in his 60s, adjusted his glasses and consulted his notes. "Ethan, I've been your family's attorney for 25 years, so I hope you'll take what I'm about to say in the spirit it's intended. There are concerns about this engagement." "What kind of concerns?" "Financial ones, primarily. Miss Bennett, no offense intended, but you come to this union with significant debt and no assets. There are those who might suggest that a prenuptial agreement—" "No." Ethan's voice was flat and final. "Absolutely not. Ethan, please just consider—" "I said no, Robert. Clara and I will be married as equals with full sharing of assets and responsibilities. If you can't draw up papers reflecting that arrangement, I'll find someone who can." Hayes looked from Ethan to Clara, clearly trying to gauge her reaction to this declaration. What he saw must have reassured him because his expression softened slightly. "Miss Bennett, I hope you understand that my concerns come from a desire to protect both of you. Marriages that cross significant economic boundaries can face unique challenges." Clara had been silent throughout most of the conversation, but now she spoke up, her voice clear and steady. "Mr. Hayes, I appreciate your concern, but I need you to understand something. I'm not marrying Ethan for his money. If he lost every penny tomorrow, if we had to start over with nothing but love and determination, I'd still choose him. That's what marriage means to me, choosing each other regardless of circumstances. And I'd choose her." Ethan added, his voice warm with conviction. "Rich or poor, in sickness and in health, with society's approval or without it. Clara is worth more to me than any amount of money." Hayes studied them both for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Very well. I'll draw up standard marriage documents with full community property provisions, but I do recommend that you both give some thought to what you'll do if the social pressure becomes too intense. Small towns can be unforgiving places." After Hayes left, Clara and Ethan sat together on the front porch, watching the sun set over the valley they both loved. The weight of other people's expectations pressed down on them like a physical force, but there was also a sense of relief in having their intentions clearly stated and legally documented. "Are you having second thoughts?" Ethan asked quietly. Clara considered the question seriously before answering. "About marrying you, never. About the wisdom of doing it here in this valley, surrounded by people who may never accept me, sometimes. We could go somewhere else, start fresh where no one knows our history. Would you want that, to leave the ranch, leave everything you've built here?" Ethan was quiet for a long time, gazing out over the land that had been in his family for 3 generations. "This place holds every memory I have of Sarah and Matthew. Their graves are here, their spirits are woven into every acre. I used to think that meant I could never leave, that walking away would be abandoning them somehow. But now I think they'd want me to choose love over location. They'd want me to build a new life with you, wherever that might be." He turned to look at her directly. "The question is what you want. This ranch, this valley. It could be ours, truly ours, if we're willing to weather the storm of disapproval. But it won't be easy." Clara reached for his hand, studying the calluses and scars that told the story of his life's work. "I've been running from difficult situations for 2 years now, running from my parents' death, from my fiancé's betrayal, from the foreclosure of their house. I'm tired of running, Ethan. I want to stand and fight for something worth having. Even if that fight lasts years, even if some people never come around, especially then, because that's when it matters most, when it costs something, when it requires courage to maintain." Clara turned to face him fully. "I love you, and I love this ranch, and I love the life we could build here together. I'm not afraid of a few narrow-minded gossips." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Clara tensed automatically but relaxed when she recognized the vehicle as belonging to Dr. Morrison. The doctor emerged with his wife and another couple Clara didn't recognize. "Evening, Ethan, Clara," Dr. Morrison called out cheerfully. "Hope you don't mind the intrusion, but we wanted you to meet some folks. This is Paul and Janet Wheeler. They just moved here from Denver, bought the old Simpson place." The introductions that followed were warm and genuine, with no undertone of judgment or curiosity about the recent scandal. Paul Wheeler, it turned out, was a veterinarian looking to establish a rural practice, and Janet was a teacher who'd already been hired by the local school. They were exactly the kind of people the valley needed. Young, educated, and refreshingly free of the social prejudices that had dominated the community for so long. "We heard about your engagement," Janet said with a smile that reached her eyes. "How wonderful for both of you. There's nothing more beautiful than two people finding love and choosing to build a life together." "Thank you," Clara replied, surprised by how much the simple acceptance meant to her. "That's very kind of you to say." "Not kind, honest," Paul interjected. "My grandmother always said that love was too precious to waste time worrying about what other people thought of it. She married my grandfather despite her family's objections. He was a Methodist and she was Catholic, which was apparently scandalous in 1923. Dr. Morrison chuckled. "And they were married for 62 years, if I remember correctly." 63, Paul corrected. "Until the day she died, she said marrying him was the best decision she ever made." The visit lasted until well after dark, with conversation ranging from ranch operations to plans for the wedding to hopes for the valley's future. By the time their guests left, Clara felt lighter than she had since the dance, buoyed by the reminder that not everyone in their community was closed-minded or judgmental. "You see," Ethan said as they prepared for bed, "we're not as alone as it sometimes seems." But the next morning brought a harsh reminder of the opposition they still faced. Clara discovered it when she went to collect the mail, an envelope with no return address, containing a single sheet of paper with words cut from magazines and pasted together, "Gold digger, leave before you destroy a good man." Clara stared at the crude message, her hands shaking slightly. She'd expected gossip, expected social snubs and cold shoulders, but this felt more sinister, more personal. Someone had taken the time and effort to create this anonymous threat, had felt strongly enough about her presence in Ethan's life to resort to harassment. "Clara," Ethan's voice came from behind her, and she quickly crumpled the paper, trying to hide it from view. "Just bills," she said, forcing a smile. But Ethan knew her too well by now to be fooled by false cheer. He gently took the crumpled paper from her hands, smoothing it out to read the hateful message. His expression darkened with each word. "Who would do this?" Clara asked, her voice small. "Someone too cowardly to sign their name," Ethan replied grimly. "Someone who thinks they can intimidate us into backing down. Maybe they're right. Maybe I should." "Don't." Ethan's voice cut through her rising panic. "Don't let them win, Clara. Don't let anonymous cowards dictate your choices. But if it gets worse, if they escalate beyond just letters." Ethan folded the paper carefully and put it in his pocket. "Then we'll deal with it together. But we don't run and we don't hide, and we sure as hell don't let them break us apart." The incident with the letter marked a turning point in their engagement period. What had started as social disapproval began to take on darker undertones. Clara found her car's tires slashed one morning. Someone spray-painted "whore" on the side of the barn in the middle of the night. Phone calls came at all hours, silent except for heavy breathing, before the line went dead. Each incident strengthened Ethan's resolve and deepened his protective instincts. He installed security cameras around the ranch, changed the locks on all the doors, and made sure Clara was never alone on the property. But he could see the toll the harassment was taking on her, the way she startled at unexpected sounds, the circles under her eyes from sleepless nights, the gradual erosion of the confidence she'd gained over their months together. "We could elope," he suggested one evening as they sat in his study, the curtains drawn against prying eyes. "Go to Vegas, get married quietly, come back as a fait accompli." Clara looked up from the book she'd been pretending to read. "Is that what you want? I want you to feel safe. I want you to be happy. If that means avoiding a big ceremony that gives our enemies more opportunities to cause trouble, then yes, that's what I want. But what about what you want? What about the ceremony, the celebration, the chance to show the whole valley that you're proud to marry me?" Ethan set down his own book and moved to kneel beside her chair. "Clara, I am proud to marry you, ceremony or no ceremony. But I'm more concerned about your well-being than about making a public statement." Clara was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the book's cover as she considered his words. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but sad. "They're winning, aren't they? The people who want to drive us apart, who think I'm not good enough for you, they're making us change our plans, making us hide, making us second-guess every decision." "No," Ethan said firmly. "They're making us be practical about our safety. There's a difference." "Is there? Because it feels like we're letting them control our lives, letting their hatred determine how we celebrate our love." The truth in her words hit Ethan like a physical blow. She was right. They were allowing their enemies to dictate the terms of their engagement, to force them into defensive postures that diminished the joy they should have been feeling. In trying to protect Clara from harassment, he was inadvertently validating the harasser's power over their lives. "You're right," he admitted. "We've been reacting instead of acting, letting them set the agenda instead of setting our own. So what do we do?" Ethan was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then his expression cleared, and Clara saw something she hadn't seen in weeks. The determined smile of a man ready to fight for what mattered most. "We do exactly what they don't want us to do. We plan a wedding, a real wedding with all the traditional ceremony and celebration that goes with it. We invite everyone in the valley, including the people who've been making our lives difficult. We make it impossible for them to ignore or dismiss what we mean to each other." "Ethan, that's incredibly risky. What if they try to disrupt the ceremony? What if they refuse to come? What if they spend the whole event whispering about us?" Ethan reached for Clara's hands, his eyes bright with conviction. "Then we'll deal with it. But we'll deal with it on our terms, as husband and wife, surrounded by the people who do support us." Clara felt something shift inside her chest. The same fierce determination that had sent her into a blizzard to find him, the same stubborn courage that had carried her through her parents' deaths and her fiancé's betrayal. She was tired of being afraid, tired of letting other people's hatred overshadow her happiness. "When?" she asked. "June, right here on the ranch under the cottonwoods where Sarah and Matthew are buried. We'll ask for their blessing and make our promises in front of God and everyone who matters to us." The image was so beautiful, so right, that Clara felt tears spring to her eyes. "They would approve, wouldn't they, your family? They'd want you to be happy again." "I know they would. Sarah always said that love multiplied rather than divided, that loving someone new didn't diminish what we'd shared, it just added to the total amount of love in the world." Clara leaned forward to kiss him, sealing their decision with all the passion and commitment she could pour into the gesture. When they broke apart, she was smiling for the first time in weeks. "June it is," she said. "Let them try to stop us." The announcement of their wedding date sent ripples through the valley's social fabric. Those who supported the union began making preparations, offers of help with flowers, music, catering, and dozens of other details that went into a proper country wedding. Those who opposed it intensified their campaign of disapproval, but somehow their efforts seemed less effective now that Clara and Ethan had reclaimed the initiative. Mrs. Henderson threw herself into wedding planning with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been waiting 3 years to see her employer happy again. The guest list was drawn up. 200 people, including everyone from close friends to business associates to distant neighbors they barely knew. The message was clear. This was not a quiet, shameful affair, but a celebration they wanted to share with their entire community. You realize some of them will come just to see if anyone objects when the minister asks, Mrs. Henderson warned as she addressed invitations. Let them come, Clara replied, arranging flowers from the garden Sarah had once tended. Let them see that love is stronger than their disapproval. The weeks leading up to the wedding were a whirlwind of activity and emotion. Clara's aunt in Ohio, despite her illness, insisted on making the journey to Wyoming to see her niece married. Dr. Morrison agreed to give Clara away since she had no father to perform that honor. The local minister, after some initial hesitation, agreed to perform the ceremony, saying that he could find no biblical objection to two people choosing love over convention. But perhaps the most touching moment came when Jim Carson approached Ethan with an unexpected offer. I'd like to stand up with you, Jim said without preamble. As your best man, I know we haven't talked much about the wedding details, but I figure you'll need someone in your corner when the time comes. Ethan was genuinely moved by the gesture. Jim Carson was one of the most respected ranchers in the valley, a man whose opinion carried weight throughout the community. His public support would send a clear message about where he stood on the controversial marriage. Jim, I appreciate the offer, but you don't have to put yourself in the middle of this. I know it could affect your own social standing. Hell, Ethan, I'm 62 years old. You think I give a damn about social standing at my age? Jim grinned and clapped Ethan on the shoulder. Besides, Mary's been after me for years to take more of a stand on things that matter. She says this is exactly the kind of thing that matters. With 2 weeks to go before the ceremony, Clara finally received the letter she'd been dreading. News from Ohio about her aunt's condition. The cancer had progressed more rapidly than expected, and the doctors were talking about months rather than years. Clara read the letter in the kitchen while Mrs. Henderson prepared lunch, tears streaming down her face at the thought of losing yet another person she loved. I have to go to her, Clara said when Ethan found her still crying at the kitchen table. I have to be there for whatever time she has left. Of course you do. We'll postpone the wedding. No. Clara's response was immediate and firm. We're not postponing anything. We've let other people's objections push us around long enough. I won't let illness do the same thing. Clara, your aunt raised you. She's the only family you have left. And she's the one who taught me that love should be celebrated when it's found, not put off for more convenient times. She'll be here for the wedding. The doctor said she has at least that long, and then I'll go to Ohio afterward to help her through whatever comes next. Ethan studied her face, seeing the pain of impending loss, warring with determination not to let that loss overshadow their joy. It was so like Clara to face tragedy with grace while refusing to be defeated by it. Then that's what we'll do, he said simply. We'll get married as planned, and then we'll face whatever comes next, together. Clara's Aunt Helen Bennett arrived in Wyoming 3 days before the wedding, frail, but determined not to miss her niece's moment of happiness. Despite the ravages of illness, she was still recognizably the woman who'd raised Clara after her parents' death. Sharp-eyed, strong-willed, and fiercely protective of those she loved. So this is the man who's stolen my Clara's heart, Helen said, studying Ethan with the intensity of someone evaluating livestock. He's handsome enough, I suppose. But can he make you happy, child? Happier than I ever thought possible, Clara replied, taking Ethan's hand in hers. Helen nodded approvingly. Good. Life's too short and too hard to settle for anything less than complete happiness in love. Your parents would be proud of the choice you've made. The night before the wedding, Clara sat beside her aunt's bed in the guest room, both women unable to sleep despite the late hour. Helen had been sharing memories of Clara's childhood stories that painted a picture of a girl who'd always been determined to find the good in difficult situations. I used to worry about you, Helen admitted. After your parents died, after that worthless boy broke your engagement, I worried that you'd close your heart completely. You were so hurt, so angry at the unfairness of it all. I did close my heart. For a long time I thought it was safer that way. But you opened it again. For him. That takes tremendous courage, Clara, to love again after you've been hurt so badly. Clara squeezed her aunt's hand gently. You taught me that courage. You showed me that even when life breaks your heart, you keep going. You keep loving, you keep believing in the possibility of joy. And tomorrow, you'll make that choice official. You'll promise to keep choosing love even when it's difficult, even when other people don't understand. Helen's eyes were bright with unshed tears. I'm so proud of you, sweetheart. So very proud. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and perfect, with the kind of crystalline air that made the mountains look close enough to touch. Clara woke early, her stomach fluttering with nerves and excitement, to find Mrs. Henderson already bustling about the kitchen with military precision. Today's the day, Mrs. Henderson announced with satisfaction. After 3 years of watching that man mourn, I finally get to see him smile again. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Flowers were arranged, chairs were set up under the cottonwoods, musicians tuned their instruments, and caterers put finishing touches on a feast that would feed the multitude of guests expected to attend. Clara submitted to having her hair styled and her dress fitted, surrounded by the women who'd become her chosen family. Mrs. Henderson, Dr. Morrison's wife, Janet Wheeler, and several other Valley wives who'd embraced her despite the social controversy. You look absolutely radiant, Mrs. Morrison declared as Clara stood before the full-length mirror in her wedding gown. The dress was simple but elegant, ivory silk with delicate lace trim fitted perfectly to her small frame. Ethan's going to take one look at you and forget how to speak. As the afternoon wore on, guests began arriving for the 5 o'clock ceremony. Clara watched from her bedroom window as cars and trucks filled the driveway and spilled onto the surrounding pasture. She was surprised by how many had come. Not just their supporters, but neutral parties, curious about the controversial wedding, and even some who'd made their disapproval known in recent months. Second thoughts, Dr. Morrison asked when he came to escort her to the ceremony. Not one, Clara replied, adjusting her veil with steady hands. I've never been more certain of anything in my life. The processional music began, and Clara took Dr. Morrison's arm, walking slowly through the house and out the front door toward the grove of cottonwoods where Ethan waited. The sight that greeted her took her breath away. Dozens of guests arranged on white folding chairs, wildflowers decorating every available surface, and in the center of it all, Ethan in his black suit, his face transformed by joy as he watched her approach. But what moved her most was what she saw beyond the human guests. 2 small headstones beneath the cottonwoods, decorated with fresh flowers and surrounded by the peaceful presence that seemed to bless their union. Sarah and Matthew were here in spirit, Clara realized, witnesses to the love that would help heal their husband and father's broken heart. As she reached Ethan's side and took his hands in hers, Clara felt a profound sense of rightness settle over her. This was where she belonged, beside this man in this place, surrounded by love, both earthly and eternal. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever disapproval they might still face, they would meet it together. The ceremony began, and Clara felt the last of her fears fall away like autumn leaves. She was no longer Clara Bennett, the frightened maid who'd arrived in Wyoming with nothing but grief and determination. She was about to become Clara Rollins' partner to one of the Valley's most respected men, mistress of a ranch that would become their shared legacy. Love, she realized, had indeed transformed her, just as it had transformed Ethan, just as it would continue to transform them both in all the years to come. As Reverend Matthew spoke the ancient words of matrimony, Clara felt the weight of 200 pairs of eyes upon her, but only one pair mattered. Ethan's green eyes bright with unshed tears of joy, as he gazed at her with such love that it took her breath away. The cottonwood leaves rustled overhead in a gentle breeze that seemed to carry whispers of approval from those who had loved this man before her. Do you, Ethan James Rollins, take Clara Marie Bennett to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish till death do you part? Ethan's voice rang clear and strong across the assembled crowd. I do, with all my heart, I do. And do you, Clara Marie Bennett, take Ethan James Rollins to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish till death do you part? Clara's eyes never left Ethan's face as she spoke the words that would bind their lives together. I do. I choose you, Ethan. Today and always I choose you. As they exchanged rings, simple gold bands that caught the late afternoon sunlight, Clara was dimly aware of movement in the crowd. Some guests sat forward eagerly, caught up in the romance of the moment. Others remained stone-faced, their disapproval evident even now. But in the front row she saw her Aunt Helen dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, and Mrs. Henderson beaming with motherly pride, and Dr. Morrison nodding his approval. By the power vested in me by the state of Wyoming and Almighty God, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Ethan, you may kiss your bride. Ethan stepped closer, his hands coming up to frame Clara's face with infinite tenderness. Hello, Mrs. Rollins, he whispered just loud enough for her to hear. Hello, Mr. Rollins, she whispered back, and then his lips were on hers in a kiss that tasted of promise and hope and forever. The crowd erupted in applause, not universal, Clara noticed even through her joy, but enthusiastic enough to drown out any murmurs of dissent. As they turned to face their guests as husband and wife, Clara saw something that made her heart soar. Even some of the people she'd expected to remain hostile were clapping, caught up, despite themselves, in the obvious authenticity of the moment. The reception that followed was everything Clara had dreamed of, and more. Tables groaned under the weight of food contributed by friends and neighbors. The musicians struck up lively country tunes that had couples swirling across the makeshift dance floor, and toasts were raised with everything from champagne to sweet tea. It felt like a genuine community celebration, the kind of event that bound people together rather than driving them apart. You did it, Jim Carson said, approaching the head table where Clara and Ethan sat, greeting well-wishers. You actually pulled it off. Half the valley's here eating your food and drinking your liquor, and most of them are having a damn good time doing it. Did you doubt we would? Ethan asked with a grin. Hell yes, I doubted it. I figured Margaret Hartwell would organize some kind of protest, or that bunch from the church would find a way to disrupt things. Instead, they're over there sampling the wedding cake like civilized human beings. Clara followed Jim's gaze to where Margaret Hartwell was indeed standing near the dessert table, though her expression suggested she was enduring the festivities rather than enjoying them. Still, she was here, which was more than Clara had expected. People surprise you sometimes, Clara said diplomatically. That they do. Speaking of surprises, you might want to brace yourself. I saw Tom Patterson heading this way, and he's got that look he gets when he's about to make a speech. Tom Patterson, who owned the largest mercantile in town and served as unofficial master of ceremonies for most community events, was indeed approaching, with a champagne glass in hand and a purposeful expression on his weathered face. The crowd quieted as he tapped his glass with a spoon. Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention for just a moment. I know we've all come here today for different reasons. Some to celebrate, some to satisfy curiosity, and some probably just for the free food. This drew chuckles from several corners of the crowd, but I think we can all agree on one thing. Love is a rare and precious commodity in this world, and when two people find it genuine and true, it deserves to be honored. Clara felt Ethan's hand tighten around hers as Tom continued. I've known Ethan Rollins since he was knee-high to a grasshopper, and I watched him build this ranch into something his father would be proud of. I also watched him nearly disappear into grief after he lost Sarah and little Matthew. For 3 years, we worried that the man we'd known and respected might never come back to us. The crowd had grown completely silent now, hanging on every word. But today, looking at Ethan's face as he married Clara, I see that man has indeed come back, not the same as before, because grief changes us all, but stronger and wiser and more appreciative of the gifts life offers. And Clara, Tom turned to address her directly. You came to this valley as a stranger, but you've proven yourself to be exactly what this community needs. Someone who sees the best in people, who works hard without complaint, and who has the courage to love without reservation. Clara felt tears threatening as Tom raised his glass. So here's to Ethan and Clara Rollins. May your love continue to grow with each passing year, and may your marriage be a blessing not just to you, but to all of us who are privileged to call you neighbors and friends. Cheers. The toast was echoed throughout the crowd with what seemed like genuine enthusiasm. Even Margaret Hartwell raised her glass, though her smile remained somewhat strained. As conversations resumed and the musicians struck up another tune, Clara felt a profound sense of belonging settle over her like a warm blanket. That was beautiful, she murmured to Ethan. Tom's always been good with words, but more importantly, he meant every one of them, and so did most of the people here tonight. The dancing continued well into the evening, with Clara finding herself passed from partner to partner as tradition demanded. Dr. Morrison spun her around the floor with surprising grace for such a large man. Jim Carson proved to be an excellent dancer despite his claims of being too old for such nonsense. Even some of the younger men who'd been among her harshest critics seemed eager to claim a dance with the new bride. It was during a particularly lively square dance that Clara caught sight of a familiar figure standing at the edge of the crowd, a woman she didn't immediately recognize, but whose posture and bearing suggested someone accustomed to authority. As Clara was swung from partner to partner in the intricate steps of the dance, she kept trying to get a better look at the mysterious guest. When the dance ended and she'd caught her breath, Clara made her way to where the woman stood. Up close, she could see that the stranger was perhaps 60, elegantly dressed with silver hair styled in a sophisticated chignon and keen blue eyes that seemed to take in everything around her. "I don't believe we've met," Clara said politely. "I'm Clara Rollins." "Congratulations on your marriage, my dear. I'm Elizabeth Hartwell." Clara felt her breath catch. Elizabeth Hartwell, Margaret's mother-in-law, the family matriarch whose approval or disapproval could make or break social standing in the valley. "What was she doing here, Mrs. Hartwell? I'm surprised to see you. I wasn't sure whether I'd come to the wedding of a ranch hand and a housemaid." Elizabeth's tone was dry, but not unkind. "My dear child, I've lived in this valley for 43 years. I've seen boom times and bust times, drought and flood boom and depression. I've learned that what matters isn't where people start, but what they do with the opportunities they're given." Clara wasn't sure how to respond to this unexpected philosophy from a woman she'd assumed would be among her harshest critics. Elizabeth continued, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by those nearby. "I've watched you since you arrived in Wyoming, Clara. I make it my business to know what's happening in this community. I know you send most of your wages to help your sick aunt. I know you've never asked for special treatment or tried to trade on your position in Ethan's household. I know you risked your life to save his during that blizzard. And I know that Margaret thinks you're nothing but a fortune hunter." "And what do you think?" Clara asked quietly. Elizabeth studied her for a long moment, those sharp blue eyes seeming to peer directly into Clara's soul. "I think my daughter-in-law is a fool. I think you're exactly what Ethan needed. Someone who saw past his grief to the good man underneath someone who loved him for himself rather than his bank account. I think this valley is lucky to have you." The endorsement from such an unexpected source left Clara speechless for a moment. Elizabeth Hartwell's opinion carried enormous weight in local society. Her approval could go a long way toward silencing the remaining critics. "Thank you," Clara managed. "That means more than I can express." "Don't thank me yet, dear. Margaret won't give up easily, and she has a talent for holding grudges, but she'll find her influence somewhat diminished now that I've made my position clear." Elizabeth's smile was sharp as a blade. "I don't often involve myself in social politics these days, but when I do, people tend to pay attention." As if summoned by the mention of her name, Margaret Hartwell appeared at her mother-in-law's elbow, her face tight with barely controlled anger. "Mother Hartwell, I didn't realize you'd decided to attend." "Of course I decided to attend. It's the social event of the season, and I wouldn't miss seeing Ethan happy again for the world." Elizabeth's tone was pleasant but firm. "You remember Ethan's new wife, don't you, dear? Such a lovely young woman." Margaret's smile could have frozen water. "Yes, we've met. How charming that you chose to have your wedding here, Clara. So rustic." "I think it's perfect," Elizabeth interjected before Clara could respond. "Nothing says permanence and commitment like exchanging vows on the land you plan to build your life on. Very romantic." The battle of wills between the two older women was fascinating to watch, but Clara was relieved when Ethan appeared at her side, having noticed the tension from across the dance floor. Mrs. Hartwell," he said, nodding politely to both women. "Thank you both for coming. I hope you're enjoying yourselves." "Very much," Elizabeth replied warmly. "It's wonderful to see you so happy, Ethan. Sarah would be delighted to know you've found love again." The mention of his first wife could have been awkward, but Elizabeth's tone made it clear she meant it as a blessing rather than a comparison. Ethan's smile was genuinely grateful. "I like to think she would approve. Clara has certainly brought joy back into my life." "As it should be," Elizabeth said firmly. "Love isn't a finite resource. Finding it again doesn't diminish what came before, it honors it." Margaret looked like she'd bitten into something sour, but before she could voice whatever objection she was formulating, the musicians struck up the opening notes of a waltz. Ethan immediately turned to Clara with an exaggerated bow. "Mrs. Rollins, would you do me the honor of this dance?" "I thought you'd never ask Mr. Rollins," Clara replied with an answering curtsy. As they moved onto the dance floor together, Clara felt all the tension of the confrontation with the Hartwells melt away. Here in Ethan's arms, moving to music under the stars, with their friends and neighbors looking on, everything felt perfect. "Elizabeth Hartwell just gave me her blessing," Clara murmured as Ethan spun her in a graceful turn. "Did she now? That's quite an honor. Elizabeth doesn't give her approval lightly." She also made it clear that Margaret won't find much support for her campaign against us. Margaret's influence was always more bark than bite. She just likes to think she runs the valley's social scene. Ethan pulled Clara closer as the music swelled. "But even if she did have real power, it wouldn't matter. The only opinion I care about is yours." "And what's my opinion?" "That you're the luckiest woman in Wyoming, married to the handsomest rancher in the territory." Clara laughed, the sound bright and joyful in the warm evening air. "That's exactly my opinion. How did you know?" "Lucky guess." As the evening wound down and guests began making their farewells, Clara found herself standing beside Aunt Helen's chair, both women watching the cleanup efforts with satisfaction. "It was a beautiful wedding, sweetheart," Helen said softly. "Your parents would have been so proud." "I kept thinking about them today, wondering if they would approve of Ethan, of the choices I've made." "Oh, they would have loved him. Your father always said the measure of a man wasn't how much money he had, but how he treated the people who couldn't do anything for him. From what I've seen, Ethan passes that test with flying colors." Clara squeezed her aunt's hand gently. "I wish you didn't have to go back to Ohio so soon." "I wish I didn't have to go back at all," Helen admitted. "But we both know that's not possible. My time is limited, and I want to spend what's left of it in my own home with my own things around me. I'll come visit as soon as we can arrange it, I promise." "I know you will, dear, but don't rush on my account. Enjoy being a newlywed. Enjoy building your life with that good man of yours. I'll be fine for a while yet." The last of the guests departed around midnight, leaving behind a scene of pleasant chaos. Overturned chairs, empty plates, scattered flowers, and the lingering scent of celebration in the air. Mrs. Henderson had already begun marshaling the cleanup crew, but Clara was surprised when several neighbors volunteered to stay and help. "Nonsense," declared Janet Wheeler when Clara protested that they'd already done enough. "This is what neighbors do for each other. You two go on to bed. Everything will be cleaned up and ready for you in the morning." The offer was too generous to refuse, especially given Clara's exhaustion after the emotional intensity of the day. She and Ethan made their way through the house, pausing to extinguish candles and turn off lights, the quiet domesticity of the moment feeling like a precious gift after hours of public celebration. "Any regrets?" Ethan asked as they climbed the stairs to their bedroom. Their bedroom now, Clara realized with a flutter of nervous excitement. "Not one. You. Only that we waited so long to do this." In the privacy of their room, with the door closed against the world and moonlight streaming through the windows, Clara felt the weight of the day finally catch up with her. She sank onto the edge of the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just occurred. "I can't quite believe it's real," she admitted. "This morning I was Clara Bennett, and tonight I'm Mrs. Ethan Rollins. It feels like a dream." Ethan knelt before her, taking her hands in his as he had during the ceremony. "It's real love. We're married and we're going to build an incredible life together. I love you." Clara said the words carrying all the emotion of the day. "I love you so much it scares me sometimes. I love you too, more than I ever thought I could love anyone again." They held each other in the moonlit quiet of their bedroom, two people who had found something precious and rare in a world that often seemed determined to tear such things apart. The ceremony was over, the public declarations made, but this moment, private and intimate and theirs alone, felt like the real beginning of their marriage. Later, as Clara lay with her head on Ethan's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, she thought about the journey that had brought them to this point. A year ago, she'd been a broken young woman with nothing but grief and determination to sustain her. Tonight, she was the wife of a good man, mistress of a thriving ranch, and surrounded by a community that was slowly but surely accepting her as one of their own. "What are you thinking about?" Ethan's voice was soft in the darkness. "Everything. The first night I came here, how terrified I was of you. The way you used to pretend to sleep so you could listen to me talking to myself. The blizzard, the dance, the wedding. It's been quite a journey. The best journeys usually are the ones you never could have planned. What do you think comes next?" Ethan was quiet for a moment, his hand stroking gently through her hair. "I think we wake up tomorrow morning and start living like the married couple we are. We work together to make the ranch even better than it is now. We stand together against whatever challenges come our way. We maybe start talking about adding to our family when you're ready for that conversation." Children. The thought sent a warm flutter through Clara's chest. She'd always wanted children, had dreamed of the family she'd planned to have with David before everything fell apart. With Ethan, that dream felt possible again, not as a replacement for his lost son, but as something new and precious they would create together. "I'm ready for that conversation," she said softly. "Someday. When we've had time to just be husband and wife for a while." "Someday," Ethan agreed. "We have all the time in the world now." As sleep began to claim them both, Clara felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. The future stretched ahead of them like an uncharted territory, full of possibilities and promises and the kind of love that grew stronger with each passing day. 3 weeks later, Clara found herself standing in her aunt's kitchen in Ohio, surrounded by the familiar scents and sounds of her childhood. Helen had deteriorated more rapidly than expected in the days following the wedding, and Clara had made the journey east to spend what time remained with the woman who had raised her. The house looked smaller than Clara remembered, shabbier and more worn, but it still held the warmth of a place where love had dwelt. Helen spent most of her time in the living room now, too weak to climb the stairs to her bedroom, but her mind remained sharp and her spirit undaunted. "Tell me again about the wedding," Helen said, as Clara brought her tea and settled in the chair beside her makeshift bed. "I want to hear every detail." Clara had already recounted the ceremony and reception multiple times, but she understood her aunt's need to relive the happiness of that day. So she told the story again, adding new details she remembered, the way Ethan's hands had shaken slightly as he placed the ring on her finger, the tears in Mrs. Henderson's eyes during the father-daughter dance, the grudging respect in Margaret Hartwell's expression by the end of the evening. "I wish I could have stayed longer," Helen said wistfully. "I would have loved to see you settled into married life, to meet all your new friends properly. You'll always be part of my new life, Aunt Helen. Distance doesn't change that." "I know, dear, but there's something I want to give you before—" Helen gestured weakly toward the bureau across the room. "Top drawer in the back. There's a small wooden box." Clara retrieved the box, recognizing it as one her aunt had kept on her dresser for as long as she could remember. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was a delicate gold locket that Clara had never seen before. "It was your mother's," Helen explained, "given to her by your father on their first anniversary. She always planned to give it to you when you got married, but, well, life had other plans. I've been saving it for the right moment." Clara opened the locket to find two tiny photographs, her parents on their wedding day, young and radiant, with hope for the future. The sight of their faces, so full of love and possibility, brought tears to her eyes. "They look so happy," she whispered. "They were, just like you and Ethan. That's how I know you've chosen well, Clara. You have that same glow they had, that same certainty that you've found your other half." Clara fastened the locket around her neck, feeling the weight of it like a blessing against her heart. "Thank you for everything you've given me over the years. I don't know what I would have done without you. You would have managed just like you managed after they died, just like you managed when David broke your heart. You're stronger than you know, Clara. You always have been." They talked late into the evening, sharing memories and making peace with the approaching goodbye. Helen slipped away peacefully in her sleep, 3 days later leaving Clara to handle the funeral arrangements and the disposal of a lifetime's worth of possessions. It was heartbreaking work, but necessary, and Clara found comfort in the knowledge that her aunt had lived to see her happily settled. Ethan arrived for the funeral, driving straight through from Wyoming to be by Clara's side. His presence was a source of strength during the difficult ceremony, and his quiet competence in handling the practical details of her aunt's estate allowed Clara to focus on grieving and remembering. "She was proud of you," he said as they stood beside Helen's grave after the service. "Anyone could see that. Proud of the woman you'd become, proud of the choices you'd made." "I hope so. I hope I lived up to what she wanted for me." "You did. You found love, you found a home, you found the courage to fight for both. That's everything she could have wanted for you." The drive back to Wyoming took 2 days, with Clara and Ethan taking turns behind the wheel and stopping frequently to stretch their legs and process the emotions of the past week. As the familiar mountains came into view, Clara felt her heart lift, despite her grief. Home. She was going home to the life she'd built with the man she loved. Mrs. Henderson greeted them with tears and casseroles and updates on everything that had happened in their absence. The ranch had run smoothly under the foreman's supervision, but it was clear that everyone had been counting the days until their return. "It's good to have you back," Mrs. Henderson said as she bustled around the kitchen, preparing a welcome home meal. "The house just isn't the same without you both in it." That evening, Clara and Ethan sat on their front porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Clara wore her mother's locket and thought about the circle of love that connected her past to her present and future. Her parents' love had created her. Helen's love had sustained her through loss and hardship, and now Ethan's love was carrying her toward possibilities she'd never dared imagine. "I've been thinking," Ethan said, breaking the comfortable silence between them. About what you said at the wedding about not being sure if your parents would approve of me. I think they would, but not for the reasons you might expect." "What do you mean?" Ethan turned to face her more directly. "I think they'd approve because I make you happy, because I love you enough to stand up to an entire community when they tried to tear us down, because I see your worth and I'm not afraid to let the world know it, but mostly because I promise to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of their daughter." Clara felt tears spring to her eyes at the beautiful sentiment. "Oh, Ethan, they would have loved you so much, and they would have been proud of the woman you've become. The way you've survived loss, the way you've opened your heart to love again, the way you've made a place for yourself in this valley. You honor their memory every day just by being who you are." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Clara leaned against her husband's side and felt the peace that comes from being exactly where you belong. The journey that had brought her to Wyoming had been difficult, marked by loss and uncertainty, and the kind of pain that changes a person forever. But it had also been necessary, leading her step by step toward the love and happiness that now filled her days. "Tomorrow is a new day," she said softly, echoing words Ethan had spoken to her months ago, in the depths of winter when their future was still uncertain. "Yes," Ethan replied, his arm tightening around her, "and this time we'll face it together." Clara smiled and settled more comfortably against his chest, listening to the night sounds of the ranch around them. Cattle lowing in the distance, wind rustling through the cottonwoods, the gentle creak of the porch swing beneath them. This was her world now, these sounds and sights, and the man who shared them with her. She had found her place at last, and she intended to treasure every moment of the love that had transformed them both, from broken individuals into something stronger and more beautiful together. The richest rancher in Wyoming had indeed found what his wealth could never buy: healing, hope, and love, reborn from sorrow. And beside him, the shy maid who had seen past his grief to the good man beneath, had discovered that sometimes the greatest fortune isn't immeasured in gold, but in the courage to love and be loved without reservation. Together they would face whatever the future held, the changing seasons, the inevitable challenges of ranch life, the joys and sorrows that come to every marriage. But they would face it as partners, as equals, in the truest sense, bound together by a love strong enough to weather any storm. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, and the sound seemed less lonely than it once had. Even the wild creatures understood. It seemed that some bonds were strong enough to last a lifetime and beyond.